Playing with Power MTG. Powerful cards, powerful formats. Be sure to check out Dragon Shield for all of the best accessories to protect your decks. TCG Player for cards at great prices while supporting local game stores. And Patreon, where you get awesome benefits for your direct support. We just restocked our Playing with Power custom sleeves by Dragon Shield. Dragon Shield is the best in the business when it comes to trading card accessories. They have a great shuffle feel, are super durable, and are printed with the best quality in the industries. If sleeves aren't your thing, check out our merchandise store. We have clothing and accessories to help you rep your love of CDH to the masses. When you buy a set of sleeves or some of our merch, you help support content like this video. We use that support to pay a fair wage for services and meet up with people at events to record. Links are in the description below, and thank you all very much. Now, let's start out by showcasing our fighters this evening. First, we have Zach piloting the partner pair of Tymna the Weaver and Chrom Ludovic's Opus. This deck, called Blue Farm, seeks to go for a quick combo win with a variety of layered lines. If it fails, it falls back on its commanders for strong card advantage. Zach's opening hand contains a Tundra, Wooded Foothills, Preordain, Sol Ring, Dispel, Fellwar Stone, and a Mystic Remora. Next, we have Greg piloting the partner pair of Thrasios Triton Hero and Vile Smasher the Fierce. Curious Control is one of the oldest decks in the format, and Greg is one of its best pilots. This deck seeks to control the board while accruing value through Rashmi-like effects. Greg's opening hand contains a Forbidden Orchard, Bloodstained Mire, Mox Amber, Counterspell, Mindbreak Trap, Drown on the Lock, and a Mystical Tutor. After that, we have Jordan piloting Rocco, Cabaretti Caterer. This is a creature combo deck aiming to generate infinite mana and win with the Walking Ballista combo. Jordan's opening hand contains a Forest, Swift Reconfiguration, Ricochet Trap, Spire Garden, Walking Ballista, Veil of Summer, and a Dockside Extortionist. Finally, we have Lincoln piloting Lazav, the Multifarious. This deck seeks to cast Buried Alive and win with a Graveyard combo. If disrupted, it can fall back on a classic Thoracle win. Lincoln's opening hand contains a Fierce Guardianship, Cyclonic Rift, Scalding Tarn, Mystical Tutor, Mystic Remora, Chrome Mox, and his London Mulligan is a Bloodstained Mire. Without further ado, let's begin this babbling back-breaking backyard balance. Zach wins the Blue Farm Plagiarism Deck Building Challenge and gets to start us off. Zach draws a card for turn and plays a Tundra. He casts a Sol Ring. He follows it up with a Fellwar Stone. He passes. Greg draws a card for turn and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He casts a Mox Amber. He passes. Jordan draws and plays a Spire Garden. He gives the turn to Lincoln. Lincoln draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He casts Chrome Mox, imprinting Mystical Tutor. He casts a turn 1, Mystic Remora. In response, Greg cracks his Bloodstained Mire, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts a Mystical Tutor. In response, Zach casts Dispel, targeting Mystical Tutor. Greg's Tutor is countered, and Mystic Remora resolves. Sitting pretty, Lincoln passes. Zach draws and casts his own Mystic Remora. Lincoln's Remora triggers, and he draws. With Zach's Remora still in the stack, Lincoln cracks his Scalding Tarn, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts Vampiric Tutor. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Then Zach's Remora resolves. Zach plays a Hallowed Fountain into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts his commander, Tymna the Weaver. He ships the turn to Greg. Greg draws and plays a Forbidden Orchard. He taps it, giving Lincoln a 1/1 Spirit to help cast his commander, Thrasios Triton Hero. He passes. Jordan draws and plays a Grove of the Burn Willows. He taps Grove of the Burn Willows to help cast Dockside Extortionist. It resolves, and Jordan creates 6 treasures. He cracks 5 of his treasures to help cast his commander, Rocco, Cabaretti Caterer, where X equals 2. It resolves, and he fetches up a Devoted Druid onto the battlefield. He cracks another treasure to help cast Swift Reconfiguration, targeting Devoted Druid. Lincoln and Zach's Remora trigger, and they both draw. In response, Greg casts Mindbreak Trap for its alternate cost, targeting Swift Reconfiguration. Lincoln and Zach's Remora trigger, and they draw. Mindbreak resolves and exiles Swift Reconfiguration. Dismayed, Jordan passes. During his upkeep, Lincoln pays for his Mystic Remora. He draws and plays an Otawara, Soaring City. He gives the turn to Zach. During his upkeep, Zach pays for his Mystic Remora. He draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. He casts his other commander, Chrom Ludovic's Opus. He moves to Crombat and attacks Greg with Chrom. Greg takes it, and in his second main phase, Zach pays 1 and draws 1 through Tymna. He ships the turn. Greg draws and in true control player fashion, takes no actions and passes the turn. Jordan draws and plays a Forest. He casts Wirewood Symbiote. He taps Devoted Druid for a green and activates Wirewood Symbiote, bouncing Rocco to his hand, untapping Devoted Druid. He casts Llanowar Elves and passes. During his upkeep, Lincoln pays for his Mystic Remora. He draws, takes no other actions, passing the turn to Zach. During his upkeep, Zach pays for his Remora. He draws and immediately moves to combat. He attacks Greg with Chrom. Greg takes it, and in his second main phase, Zach pays 1 and draws 1 through Tymna. Zach plays a Polluted Delta. He ships the turn. Greg draws and takes no other actions, passing to Jordan. Jordan draws, and in his first main phase, he casts Worldly Tutor. Lincoln and Zach's Remora's trigger, and they both draw. Worldly Tutor resolves, and Jordan fetches up a Vizier of Remedies onto the top of his library. All through, he passes. During his upkeep, Lincoln pays for his Remora. He draws and takes no other actions. He passes. At the end of Lincoln's turn, Zach cracks his Polluted Delta, pays a life, and fetches up a Watery Grave onto the battlefield tapped. He casts Brainstorm. Lincoln's Remora triggers, and he draws. Zach realizes he probably shouldn't play Legacy after sequencing this play, and Brainstorm resolves. He draws 3 and puts 2 back on top. Still in the end step, Jordan casts Veil of Summer. Both Remoras trigger, and Zach and Lincoln draw. Veil resolves, and Jordan draws. The table braces for Jordan's next move, but he doesn't have one. Lincoln discards the hand size, and the turn moves to Zach. During his upkeep, Zach pays for his Remora. He draws and moves to combat, attacking Greg with Crom. Greg takes it, and in his second main phase, Zach pays 1 and draws 1 through Tymna. Zach casts Dragon's Rage Channeler. He follows it up with a Lotus Petal. Channeler and Lincoln's Remora trigger. Lincoln draws, and then Zach surveils Witchclaw Talisman into his graveyard. Zach passes. At the end of Zach's turn, Greg casts Brainstorm. Both Remoras trigger, and both players draw. Brainstorm resolves, and Greg draws 3 and puts 2 back on top. Zach discards the hand size, and the turn moves to Greg. Greg draws and plays a Windswept Heath. He explains to Zach how you're supposed to fetch after Brainstorm, not before. The table laughs, and Greg taps his Forbidden Orchard, giving Lincoln a spirit to help cast Flame Sweep. Both Remoras trigger, and both players draw. In response, Jordan floats a green with his Devoted Druid. He activates Wirewood Symbiote, bouncing Devoted Druid back to his hand, untapping his Llanowar Elves. Flame Sweep resolves, nuking the board. Greg cracks his Windswept Heath, pays a life, and fetches up a Tropical Island onto the battlefield. He passes. Jordan draws and plays a Forest. He recasts his Devoted Druid. Jordan gives the turn to Lincoln. During his upkeep, Lincoln lets his Remora die. He draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Watery Grave onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a Mana Crypt. Zach's Remora triggers, and he draws. Lincoln follows it up with a Rhystic Study. Remora triggers, and Zach draws again. In response, Zach casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card, countering Rhystic. Lincoln then follows up by casting his commander, Lazav the Multifarious. It enters, and Lincoln surveils Notion Thief into his graveyard. He passes and discards Necrotic Ooze to hand size. During his upkeep, Zach lets his Remora die. He draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He casts Imperial Seal. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. He moves to combat and attacks Greg with Crom. Greg takes it, and in his second main phase, Zach casts Preordain. He scries 2 and draws a card. He casts a Talisman of Dominance. He passes. Greg draws and plays a Command Tower. He casts Jace, Wielder of Mysteries. It resolves, and he activates Jace's first ability, targeting Jordan. Jordan mills 2, and Greg draws. Greg gives the turn to Jordan. Jordan draws and plays a Sunbaked Canyon. He taps it to help cast Vizier of Remedies. This is a big problem, because it goes infinite with Devoted Druid. Surprisingly, it resolves. He taps his Devoted Druid for mana. He activates it and attempts to untap it. In response, Zach cracks his Verdant Catacombs, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts Cyclonic Rift, targeting Devoted Druid. In response, Jordan activates Devoted Druid's untap ability again. He presents a loop of putting a -1/-1 counter on Devoted Druid to untap it, but the counter being negated through Vizier. He does this over and over, generating infinite green mana. The Cyclonic Rift resolves, and Devoted Druid bounces back to Jordan's hand. He casts Walking Ballista, where X equals 500,000. In response, Zach casts Intuition, targeting Greg. He fetches up a Pact of Negation, Savine's Reclamation, and an Underworld Breach. Greg gives Zach Pact of Negation. Zach casts Pact of Negation, targeting Walking Ballista. In response, Jordan casts Ricochet Trap for its alternate cost, targeting Pact. In response, Lincoln casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost, targeting Ricochet Trap. With no more answers, Fierce counters Trap and Pact counters Ballista. With the stack cleared up and with his win attempt thwarted, Jordan uses some of his infinite green to recast his Devoted Druid. He passes. At the end of Jordan's turn, Lincoln casts Entomb. Zach finally remembers his Crom triggers, and he draws. In response, Greg casts Flusterstorm, with all copies targeting Entomb. Entomb is countered, and the turn moves to Lincoln. During his upkeep, Lincoln wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and casts a Mox Amber. He casts Ashiok, Dream Render. Crom triggers, and Zach draws. In response, Zach casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost, targeting Ashiok. In response, Lincoln casts Miscast, targeting Fierce. Miscast counters Fierce, and Ashiok resolves. Lincoln activates Ashiok, targeting himself. He mills 4, and all other players exile their graveyards, which includes Zach's Underworld Breach and Savine's Reclamation. With nothing else, Lincoln passes. During his upkeep, Zach pays for his Pact of Negation. He draws and moves straight to combat, attacking Greg with Crom. Greg takes it, and in his second main phase, Zach casts that Mana Crypt. He casts Peer into the Abyss. In response, Lincoln casts Delay, targeting Peer. Peer is countered and exiled with 3 time counters on it. Zach gives the turn to Greg. Greg draws and then pays 2 life to help cast Gitaxian Probe, targeting Zach. He looks at Zach's hand and draws a card. He activates Jace, milling Zach for 2 and drawing a card. He plays a Verdant Catacombs. He casts Curiosity, targeting Thrasios? The table reminds Greg that he actually has 2 commanders, and then everyone laughs. Crom triggers and Zach draws. Greg moves to combat and attacks Zach with Thrasios. Zach takes it, Curiosity triggers, and Greg draws. He ends his turn. Jordan draws, takes no actions, and passes. During his upkeep, Lincoln loses his mana crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and activates Ashiok. He mills 4, and all other players exile their graveyards. He passes. During his upkeep, Zach removes a time counter from Peer into the Abyss. Also during his upkeep, he loses his mana crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Badlands. He moves to combat and attacks Greg with Crom. Greg declares no blocks, and before damage, he casts Pyroblast, targeting Crom. Crom is destroyed, and in his second main phase, Zach casts Necropotence. In response, Greg casts Counterspell, targeting Necropotence. Necropotence is countered, and Zach wonders if he can resolve a meaningful spell this game. He recasts Crom. He gives the turn to Greg. Greg draws and plays an Underground River. He activates Jace, targeting Zach. In response, Lincoln activates Lazav, targeting Notion Thief in his graveyard. Lazav's ability resolves and becomes a copy of Notion Thief. Zach mills 2, and Lincoln draws a card through Notion Thief. Greg follows it up with a Seedborn Muse. With a powerful value engine on the board, Greg passes. Greg untaps with Jordan. Jordan draws, takes no actions, passing the turn. At the end of Jordan's turn, Greg casts Drown in the Loch, targeting Lazav. Lazav is destroyed, and still in the instep, Greg taps his Forbidden Orchard, giving Jordan a 1/1 spirit to help activate Thrasios. He scries 1 and reveals an Assassin's Trophy into his hand. The turn moves to Lincoln. Greg untaps with Lincoln. During his upkeep, Lincoln wins his mana crypt roll. He draws and plays a Reflecting Pool. He activates Ashiok's ability, targeting himself. He mills 4, and all other players exile their graveyards. He recasts his commander, Lazav. In response, Greg taps his Forbidden Orchard, giving Jordan a 1/1 spirit to help activate Thrasios. He scries 1 and reveals a Thassa's Oracle into his hand. Lazav enters, and Lincoln surveils, leaving the card on top. The turn passes to Zach. Greg untaps with Zach. During his upkeep, Zach wins his mana crypt roll. Also during his upkeep, Zach removes the time counter from Peer into the Abyss. He draws and moves to combat, attacking Ashiok with Crom. Ashiok dies, and in his second main phase, Zach casts Mystical Tutor. In response, Greg cracks his Verdant Catacombs, pays a life, and fetches up a Taiga onto the battlefield. Mystical Tutor resolves, and Zach fetches up a Toxic Deluge onto the top of his library. He pays 2 life to help cast Gitaxian Probe, targeting Greg. In response, Lincoln activates Lazav, targeting Notion Thief in his graveyard. In response, Greg activates Thrasios, scrying 1, and revealing a Mox Diamond into his hand. Lazav then becomes a copy of Notion Thief, and Gitaxian Probe resolves. Zach looks at Greg's hand, and Lincoln draws through Notion Thief. Zach plays a Mana Confluence. He recasts his commander, Tymna the Weaver. He passes. At the end of Zach's turn, Greg casts Assassin's Trophy, targeting Lazav. Lazav is destroyed, and Lincoln fetches up an island onto the battlefield. Zach ends his turn. Greg draws and casts Imperial Seal. In response, Jordan adds a green through Devoted Druid. He untaps it through its ability. He uses his floating mana to help sacrifice Sunbaked Canyon to draw a card. Imperial Seal resolves, and Greg fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. He activates Jace's first ability, targeting Zach. Zach mills 2, and Greg draws. He activates Thrasios, scrying 1, and revealing a Lim-Dûl's Vault into his hand. He taps his Forbidden Orchard, giving Jordan a 1/1 spirit to help cast Lim-Dûl's Vault. Crom triggers, and in response, Lincoln casts Pongify, targeting Seedborn Muse. Pongify resolves, Seedborn is destroyed, and Greg creates a 3/3/8. Crom's trigger resolves, and Zach draws. Lim-Dûl's Vault resolves, and Greg repeats the process 5 times, paying 5 life. He then shuffles and rearranges the top 5. All set up, Greg passes. Jordan draws and makes infinite mana through his Devoted Druid combo. The table braces, and he uses that mana to cast Elvish Mystic. He plays a Yavimaya, Cradle of Growth. He passes. During his upkeep, Lincoln loses his mana crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and takes no other actions, passing the turn. During his upkeep, Zach wins his mana crypt roll. Also during his upkeep, he removes the last time counter from Peer into the Abyss. He casts it, and in response, Lincoln flashes in a Dress Down. In response to Dress Down, Jordan uses his Devoted Druid combo to create infinite green mana. Dress Down resolves, and Lincoln draws a card. Then, Peer into the Abyss resolves. Zach draws half of his library and loses half of his life, rounded up. He draws and casts Mox Opal. He casts Mox Diamond, discarding Gemstone Caverns. He casts Chrome Mox, imprinting Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer. He casts Dark Ritual, adding 3 black. He casts Cabal Ritual with Threshold, adding 5 black. He casts Praetor's Grasp, targeting Lincoln. He fetches up a card from Lincoln's library into exile face down. He casts Demonic Tutor, fetching up a card into his hand. He casts Silence. Knowing that this is the moment to act, Lincoln casts Flusterstorm with all copies targeting Silence. Silence is countered, and Zach follows it up with a Vampiric Tutor. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. He casts Sensei's Divining Top. He activates Top, drawing a card and putting Top on top. He casts Chain of Vapor, targeting Dress Down. It bounces, and Lincoln sacrifices an island to continue the chain, targeting Tymna. Zach sacrifices Watery Grave to continue the chain, targeting his Mox Opal. He holds priority and floats mana from his Chrome Mox, Mox Diamond, and Mox Opal. With Zach's copy of Chain of Vapor on the stack, Lincoln flashes in Dress Down again. In response, Zach casts Swansong, targeting Dress Down. Dress Down is countered this time, and Lincoln creates a 2/2 bird. Chain of Vapor resolves, and Zack sacrifices a Badlands to continue the chain, targeting his Mox Diamond. He sacrifices Tundra to bounce his Chrome Mox, and then decides to stop there. Zack casts Gamble. He fetches up a card into his hand, and then randomly discards an Esper Sentinel. He recasts Mox Opal. He recasts Mox Diamond, discarding Blood Crypt. He casts what he exiled from Lincoln's library with Praetor's Grasp, Thassa's Oracle. It resolves, and with the trigger on the stack, he casts Tainted Pact. He exiles cards from the top of his library until he reveals Demonic Consultation. He puts Consultation into his hand. Zack explains that he has 3 cards left in his library and is trying to play around any possibility of Chrom triggers losing him the game. With Thassa's Oracle trigger on the stack, Lincoln casts Cyclonic Rift, targeting Thassa's Oracle. It resolves, and Thassa is bounced to Lincoln's hand. The ability resolves, and Zack looks at the top card of his library, putting it onto the bottom. He casts his own Thassa's Oracle. It resolves, but the table is all out of answers this time. Thassa's Oracle trigger resolves, and Zack wins the game. Ladies and gentlemen, what a game. Congrats to Zack on his win. He leveraged his commander's powerful abilities, all while controlling the board. He bided his time, stopping other players' win attempts until their resources had been exhausted. Zack crept his advantage forward until going for his combo finish. The most valuable card in tonight's game goes to Praetor's Grasp. This card allowed Zack to play more aggressively than he previously would have been able to. The ability to stop Lincoln's win and then steal it from himself is extremely powerful. Zack's heads-up play to take Thoracle from Lincoln allowed him to go for the win even after he was initially stopped. Praetor's Grasp is a powerful card that showed its power here tonight. Well, that about wraps it up for this episode. Tune in next time we duke it out to see who will be king of the competitive EDH table. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you next time.